On April 17th, 1524, Giovanni da Verrazzano sailed into New York Bay. As he entered the Narrows, Verrazzano saw that the country was well-peopled and that they were clad with feathers of fowls of divers colors. They came towards us very cheerfully, making great shouts of admiration, showing us where we might come to land safely with our boat. Suddenly, there was a flow of contrary wind from the sea, and the first European to lay eyes on the Hudson River left after only this brief tour. Around 4000 BC, a people called the Algonquins migrated from the Pacific across land routes to the Hudson Valley. When the Indians decided to settle permanently in this verdant forest of oak and hickory, they found that their greatest enemy resided in the ease of life the river provided. They grew soft in their ability to defend themselves and were constantly raided by the highly organized, warring Iroquois tribes from further north. 55 centuries before Verrazzano drew close to the shore near Manhattan and saw them, friendly, admiring, brightly decked with feathers, the Indians had begun to establish their villages. It was 85 years after Verrazzano's visit that Henry Hudson, the famous English navigator, was hired by Dutch merchants to locate a northwest passage to China. On the morning of September 2nd, 1609, a dense fog covered the Atlantic coastline as the half moon moved along the New Jersey shore. A bright, hot sun climbed above the heavy cloud and burned away the mist, revealing a line of broken islands. Henry Hudson decided to enter New York Bay. That decision led him to spend the next 4 weeks observing the land and exploring the river that was to bear his name. Friendly natives, clad in loose deerskin and feather mantles, came aboard the Half Moon, bringing green leaves of tobacco, maize, and loaves of cornbread. But 5 men sent out to explore upriver were attacked on their return by 2 boatloads of natives. 3 of the men were shot by arrows. 1, wounded in the neck, lay in the boat, grasping his throat, slowly bleeding to death. It grew dark. The survivors rowed about the entire night, unable to find their way back to their ship until morning. When they were next approached by natives who had come to trade, the crew took 2 of them prisoner to hold as hostages. Day after day, as the Half Moon silently glided upriver past the Palisades and the shallow, wide Haverstraw Bay, the clear September sky continued hot with little wind. The land grew high, describing what indeed came to be called the Highlands. They passed the purple-blue mountains of the Catskills. While they were anchored for the night, their hostages slipped away. As the wind rose and filled their sails the next morning, the escaped captives waited on shore to shout obscenities at the little ship moving upstream. Captain Hudson himself visited an Indian village where he dined on pigeons and a fat dog killed for the occasion, skinned with oyster shells and roasted. The natives intended for the captain to spend the night. A fragment of his log states, "The natives are a very good people. For when they saw I would not remain, they supposed that I was afraid of their bows, and taking the arrows, they broke them in pieces and threw them into the fire." Near Albany, 22 days' sail from its mouth, Henry Hudson looked at the river's shallow, muddy tidal flats. He stood on the high deck of the Half Moon and knew that the little ship still rode at sea level, 150 miles inland from the great ocean. When he reached for a cupful of brackish water, Its taste was fresh. The river's source lay somewhere ahead in the mountains. He had not discovered a passage to China. The Dutch, whose most lucrative trading posts were in the Far East, moved slowly to establish a colony in the Hudson Valley. Johannes de Laet, an officer of the Dutch West India Company responsible for the settlement, wrote of the Hudson, "On this river there is a great traffic in the skins of beavers, otters, foxes, bears, minks, wildcats, and the like. The land is excellent and agreeable, full of noble forest trees and grapevines, and nothing is wanting but the labor and industry of man. For the savages who inhabit there are indolent, and some of them are evil thieves and wicked people." Kilean van Rensselaer, a Dutch diamond merchant and stockholder, urged the company to issue a charter of privileges to patroons. Holland herself was experiencing a period of prosperity and freedom, and while quick profits would attract a certain element of petty trader in the New World, in the long run they would exhaust the country. Kilean never came to America, though his sons eventually did. He shrewdly hired an agent till his holdings measured 20 miles long by 45 miles, spread east to west. Van Rensselaer wrote to Governor Kieft in 1639, "I would not like to have my people get too wise and figure out their master's profit." In addition to receiving 1/3 of a tenant's harvest, Kilean ground their grain at his mill, issued them licenses to hunt his land, and sold them supplies from his commissary, all at a large profit to himself. Thus began an old feudal tenant system in the new land. For over 200 years, ironically continuing until well after the Revolutionary War, this system was to cause grief and warfare between the farmers of the valley, who leased the farmlands, and the lord of the manor, who owned the farmer's house and a share of his crops, in a perpetual leasehold. Tenants joined the patriotic effort in the war for independence because they thought the new republic would divide the large Tory-owned estates among small independent farmers like themselves. And when the long struggle of the war years was over, it became apparent that the confiscated property of the British sympathizers would be absorbed by the rich and established families who also had supported General Washington. Although there was a mix of some 18 languages being spoken in Manhattan by 1643, the flavor of the valley settlements was Dutch and English. The life these farmers and traders shared with the residing tribes of Algonquins deteriorated. Already, Governor Kieft unwisely settled one dispute by surprising an Indian camp and massacring sleeping men, women, and children, assuring the need of the wall fort at Wall Street for the refuge of all white residents. Once the tomahawk was unburied, the Indian was committed to war and vengeance with a passion few white men ever understood. Even if carried out years after the original crime, revenge to the Indian was a virtue which gave him status and authority within the tribe. The greatest chief had no delegated authority other than public opinion. When public opinion went against him, his power was lost. The Delaware Indians at Esopus near Kingston complained that the white man had spoiled their hunting grounds. The traders gave them brandy when they brought their pelts and then cheated them while they were drunk. The rich lands traditionally cultivated by the Indians were encroached upon, and when the boundary line was openly disputed by the Indians, the white man always seemed to find a way to justify ownership in his favor. Eventually, these grievances flared into the Esopus Wars with much loss of blood on both sides. For the Dutch settler, often without warning, came the sudden war whoop, the deadly blow, followed by scalping. Some members of a family were allowed to live, kidnapped and adopted into the tribe. A surprising number never tried to return to the white community, preferring the Indian way of life. Other white captives, more psychologically bound than actually imprisoned, wandered in the wilderness as part of a pack, tethered at night like animals or sometimes only carelessly guarded, seeing the image of a wife or husband brutally murdered over and over, living in terror but mechanically part of tribal life for 10 or 12 years, until suddenly a moment of escape was possible. Religion was more important to the French Catholics in Quebec and the Puritans in New England than to the Dutch. The Dutch were not seeking to convert the Indian to Christianity, nor did they display their own religious feelings. The company directors gave their official blessing to the Calvinism of the Dutch Reformed Church, but first and foremost, profit, not religious fervor, was being sought. A modern historian concludes that what has come to be seen as the American way more closely resembles the early Dutch culture than any of the other groups of colonists. Governor Peter Stuyvesant had already heard the rumor that Charles II was sending warships to take over New Netherland. The King of England needed cash and wanted to rid himself of Dutch competition. And besides, the colony was just right as a gift for his brother, James, Duke of York and Albany. The fleet dropped anchor at the tip of Manhattan and pointed its guns at the rotting wooden palisades of Fort Amsterdam. Governor Stuyvesant stomped around on his silver-encased wooden leg, shouted down his burgomasters, and tore up the generous terms of surrender. Among them, the English offer of full property rights for the Dutch. Despite Stuyvesant's passionate call for resistance, the assembled residents remained unenthusiastic. They could easily gaze out on the British fleet in the harbor and compare the English show of force with their crumbling fortress and rusting guns. Renamed New York, the province and the city were not a satisfying investment for the Duke, whose governors found it difficult to collect customs duties and taxes from the dissident colonials, soon demanding representative government. It was believed that maintaining ownership of large landholdings and creating new ones would ease the transition. The British came to realize that it also slowed settlement. Governor Bellamont in 1700 wrote, "What man will be such a fool as to become a base tenant, when for crossing Hudson's River that man can, for a song, purchase a good freehold in the Jerseys?" The Iroquois united 5 Indian tribes into a league that had dominated New York since 1570. Very likely, too, Benjamin Franklin first took from the League of 5 Nations the idea that 13 colonies might form a confederation of 13 equal states. Once the English took over the Hudson Valley, territory and trade rivalry with the French became intense. The Iroquois League quickly understood that it could maintain a position of importance only by becoming neutral. For over a century, the 2,000 Iroquois warriors held the balance of power between France and Britain in the New World. An enterprising, self-made man, Frederick Phillips, started as a carpenter for the Dutch West India Company and came to own 90,000 acres with the help of two well-chosen marriages. His upper mills, located on the Pocantico River just before it enters the Hudson, was no doubt the first commercial complex of its kind in the colony. The tenant population expanded to 1,100 farmers who rented farms of 20 to 300 acres each. The slaves totaled about 100, making the estate even more financially agreeable. The Van Cortlandt Manor, contingent to the Phillips property, contained over 86,000 acres, assembled by Olaf Stevens, a former soldier who also arrived in New Amsterdam in the service of the Dutch West India Company. Somewhere along the way, Olaf added Van Cortlandt to his name, and like Frederick Phillips, served in public office. Both men, it seems, had an instinct for the advantageous moment. These and other families became the basis of the New York aristocracy, who intermarried generation after generation within a tight circle of commercial and landholding families. By 1754, the intermittent clashes between the French and English burst into full conflict. Britain suffered defeat after defeat as the French dropped deeper into New York State, as far south as Fort William Henry on Lake George. After 2,000 British surrendered, and despite contrary orders, France's Indian allies responsible for safe conduct of the prisoners slaughtered 200 of them. But the great victories of 1759 belonged to Britain, including a decisive assault on Quebec. With the surrender of Montreal a year later, French rule in North America was ended. Ironically, in disposing of the enemy, Britain now stood alone, having rid the Americans of outside threat. It'd be some years yet before a grumbling dissatisfaction would explode into rebellion. On September 15, 1776, New York City was easily taken by the British. The poorly trained American troops fled across Manhattan, made a valiant last stand at Harlem Heights, and moved northeast to White Plains. Without General Washington's determination, the desertion and chaos which accompanied the retreat might have doomed the straggling Patriots' army. 5 months earlier, an exuberant crowd had cheered the American commander's entrance into the city. Then, the Declaration of Independence was still being argued and rewritten. The British fleet was just landing General Howe's experienced, well-equipped army on Staten Island. The British already dominated the Atlantic seacoast. If they could seize control of the Hudson River, they could divide the colonies in half, isolate New England, and devour them piecemeal. To replenish their short food supply, General John Burgoyne sent 600 men to capture supplies at Bennington, Vermont, but they were badly defeated by the Patriots. Volunteers, encouraged by the American success, began to sign up for the cause of liberty, adding to the ranks now commanded by General Horatio Gates. Meanwhile, in the Mohawk Valley, the British, led by Barry St. Leger, and Iroquois, led by Chief Joseph Brant, ambushed General Nicholas Herkimer near Oriskany. General Herkimer, fatally wounded, sat under a beech tree and calmly smoked his pipe, directing the progress of the battle. When General Benedict Arnold showed up later with 1,200 men, the British left hurriedly, abandoning valuable equipment and freeing Arnold to then join General Gates at Saratoga. General Gates dug in at Bemis Heights and awaited General Burgoyne making his way down the Hudson. It was a year to the day that New York City had fallen. The two forces met 4 days later. They fought and skirmished for over 2 weeks until Burgoyne withdrew. While the Americans gathered new forces, sickness and wounds afflicted the British, still dangerously low on supplies. On October 17th, Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne surrendered. no doubt damning General Howe, who decided without warning, rather than come upriver, he would move the main body of his forces against Philadelphia, leaving Sir Henry Clinton with 8,000 or 9,000 men to hold New York City. Clinton took the small force he could spare upriver and with some clever maneuvering, captured 2 forts in the Highlands. Once the chain and barricades across the river were destroyed, the white sails of the British ships moved ominously on past Poughkeepsie. Farmers' wagons loaded with household goods filled the backcountry roads, wheels groaning under the weight and strain of precious belongings being moved to safety to a nearby relative, but away from the river. Troops landed at Esopus Island and burned 116 houses in Kingston. Only one was left standing. Tradition has it that the owner brought out barrels of rum which he freely offered to the pillaging soldiers.
This was a land they could have loved and shared its homes and farms. This was a land they could have had without resource to arms. But Kingston town was burned that day, every house but one, and it burned in the hearts of Ulster men until the war was won.
In the 3 hours it took to reduce Kingston to ashes and stone walls, the redcoats found time to cross the river and destroy 2 houses at Claremont on the huge 160,000-acre estate of the Livingston family. The royalist manor lords downriver considered the Livingstons, along with the Van Rensselaers and the Van Cortlands, traitors to their class who subscribed to the dangerous democratic ideas of the malcontented lower classes. Clinton's meager forces had almost reached Albany when Sir Henry learned of Burgoyne's surrender. He withdrew downriver and returned to New York City. It was a turning point in the war, this victory for the Americans. British strength had been reduced by 1/4 by men Burgoyne once scorned for not being trained in military science. There was bickering within the high command. Gates had suspended Benedict Arnold, who had ignored Gates' orders, ridden into the midst of the fighting and gotten shot in the leg, and now loudly proclaimed responsibility for winning the battle. There was rejoicing in Albany and in towns up and down the river. Loyalist stronghold New York City, which had taken on the aura of a European capital, paused from its round of parties, theater, and horse races to register shocked concern. In France, Louis XVI was so impressed by the victory at Saratoga, he agreed to commit French soldiers, guns, and money to the American effort, an alliance that was to play so important a role in the ultimate success of the revolution. George Washington personally ordered West Point fortified, exclaiming it was the key to America. Here the river makes a double-angled turn, causing the square riggers to lose headway in maneuvering their course upriver. Giant links of chain were forged and floated on huge logs anchored between West Point and Constitution Island. Once the massive fortification was completed, it was never attacked, though it was almost betrayed by its commander, General Benedict Arnold. Throughout 1775, the 6 nations of the Iroquois, the Tuscaroras, had since joined the 5 nations, were wooed by both the Americans and the British. The Americans asked only for their neutrality. This, they said, is a family quarrel between us and Old England. We desire you to remain at home and not join on either side. The Iroquois listened earnestly to the promises of each and then agreed separately to both of their wishes. But by 1776, it was evident that the Indian had chosen to fight along the side of the English. The Indian concerns were land and trade. And of great importance, the Indian and his family could expect the gifts to which they were hopelessly addicted to be more lavishly dispensed by the British than by the Americans at Albany. Ironically, the birth of the American nation saw the death of the great Iroquois League. The Oneida and the Tuscarora sided with the colonies, dividing the Iroquois for the first time in their 200-year history. In a bloody battle, Iroquois fought Iroquois, and later among the tribes, revenge was met with revenge until the American Revolution had the effect of becoming, for the Indian, a civil war. The warriors were not able to understand how a man could allow another man to commit him to battle against his will. The Indian fought where and when he chose. He needed time to ready himself psychologically for battle in dance and ceremony. The loot and captives resulting from a successful raid belonged to him. But to a white commander, the Indians were unreliable. A British officer stated, "They don't know their own minds an hour. The most trivial occurrence alarms them and carries off their attention from the object they'd an hour before in view. Such another set of credulous, whimsical, capricious devils the world cannot produce." The British and their Indian allies continued their raids, and by 1780, attacks had devastated the Mohawk Valley. The European rules of warfare rarely figured in these forays of 50 or 60 warriors. Their effort, which they achieved, was to keep the rebels in a continued state of alarm and apprehension and destroy their resources. At the end of the Revolution, the Americans blamed the Iroquois for the unprovoked war which the Indians have waged against the Americans and proclaimed, "You are a subdued people." The Oneidas and the Tuscaroras, who had allied with the rebels and tried to rebuild their old villages, discovered they were to be treated also as enemies. New York refused to recognize their claims to lands held before the Revolution. Within 15 years, all the Iroquois holdings would be reduced to a small portion of their former size, limited to a number of reservations. The British were forced to set aside 2 tracts of land in Canada. In 1785, the Iroquois began their migration north. Even as the British surrendered at Yorktown, Virginia, General Washington knew he must yet keep the long vigil until a final peace was concluded. The British still occupied New York City, and the French would soon be leaving America. In October 1782, he marched the Continental Army north to the Hudson Highlands. There, a military village of log houses was laid out with 700 buildings to accommodate 7,000 to 8,000 soldiers. During the long, tedious winter, anonymous documents called the Newburgh Letters, urging rebellion, were circulating among the disgruntled officers. It was felt that Congress would be reluctant to give them back pay now that peace was near. Inflation was rampant. Through an officer of his bodyguard, Washington learned of the budding mutiny and the movement afoot to destroy Congress. He called a meeting of his officers and stood silently, ready to address his men. He reached for the spectacles, which the Philadelphia astronomer David Rittenhouse had ground for him, and began. "You have seen me grow gray in your service. Now I am growing blind." General Washington used more than 120 private houses as his headquarters during the long years of the Revolution. One of the best known is the Hasbrouck House in Newburgh. And he had Colonel Louis Nicola asked the rhetorical question, can the country ever prosper with Congress, a sort of committee which each state heeds as it sees fit? Nicola, with the support of other officers, proposed a monarchy for America and reasoned that the esteemed Washington would make a fitting king. While a lesser man might have felt flattered, Washington bristled with hurt pride. Be assured, sir, I must view with abhorrence and reprehend with severity. Banish these thoughts from your mind. If I am not deceived in the knowledge of myself, you have not found a person to whom your schemes are more disagreeable. Many an evening was spent at Vale's Gate, where Generals Knox, Greene, and Gates were headquartered at the Ellison House. An aide remembers hearing the soft murmur of the convalescent Martha voicing her concern for Washington's late return. Washington longed to be at his home on the banks of the Potomac. He was embarrassed to learn his mother was going about Fredericksburg, poor-mouthing her circumstances, causing a collection to be taken up. On April 19, 1783, General Washington announced that a preliminary peace had been signed. Some British officers, in a last-minute humorous defiance, left the Union Jack flying over the garrison. When the Americans attempted to retrieve it, they discovered it was nailed to the pole, and the pole was greased. Someone thought of raising the American flag temporarily by attaching it to a stick. The British ships, loading troops from barges near the battery wall, saw their flag still valiantly flapping as the cannon booms of the 13 salutes began. That day, along the shore of the battery were great crowds of people. Strangely, on this day, those assembled did not jeer or taunt the departing soldiers. Rather, they stood silently watching the last vestiges of royal claim retreat from the new land. It now belonged to them alone. President George Washington was inaugurated in L'Enfant's Federal Hall. Chancellor Livingston read the oath, and Washington repeated it, resting his hand upon the Bible. George Washington, the true 18th century man, died 2 weeks before the end of the century. He served the presidency with characteristic caution, attempting to reconcile the differences between Jefferson, who undertook to educate the citizenry, and Hamilton, who favored a strong central government ruled by aristocrats. Peace had come. The soldiers camped along the Hudson had long since marched away to their homes and families. The chain stretched across the river was released. The Tories sailed away to Canada. Now, after so many long years of forced idleness, the Hudson was once more filled with traffic. Hundreds of sloops crowded the river, owned or chartered by merchants. There were sloops called packets to carry people 150 miles between New York and Albany. Hudson River farmers shipped their vegetables, grain, and apples to New York markets and relied on the captain's ability to bargain for a fair price. He became a general agent for the whole town. Washington Irving later rode to the river as it was in 1800. Our captain was a worthy man, native of Albany, of one of the old Dutch stocks. His crew was composed of blacks reared in the family and belonging to him, for Negro slavery still existed in the state. They were obedient to his orders, though they occasionally had much previous discussion of the wisdom of them. This was especially the case with an old gray-headed Negro who had sailed with the captain's father when the captain was a mere boy, and who was very crabbed and conceited on points of seamanship. Caught in a sudden squall, many a sloop was last seen at World's End, where the river curves around West Point and drops to a depth of over 200 feet. In 1840, N.P. Willis wrote of the skill of the sailors and the beauty of the sloop. Up they come with a dashing breeze under Anthony's nose and the sugar loaf, and giving the rocky toe of West Point a wide berth, all down helm and round into the bay, when, just as the peak of Crow Nest slides its shadow over the mainsail, slap comes the wind aback, and the whole fleet is in a flutter. The channel is narrow and serpentine, the wind baffling and small room to beat, but the craft are worked merrily and well, and dodging about as if to escape some invisible imp of the air, they gain point after point till at last they get the dunderbark behind them and fall once more into the regular current of the wind. Sloops brought elegant ladies to the races at Saratoga, peddlers to the Mohawk Valley towns, and crowding the river and harbor of New York long after the steam engine was supposed to have made them obsolete. 20th century historian and Hudson River folklorist Carl Karma wrote, "The Hudson sloops had experienced much before they left the river. Their skippers and their passengers had seen many things that once were beautiful and that, like the sloops themselves, have gone from the river now. In the early days, they'd beheld the great autumn bush burnings when, to clear away the dead underbrush and make hunting and berry picking easy, the Indians had set forest fires on both sides of the river, and the sloop seemed to be drifting through the gold nave of a high cathedral, pillared with towering flame. On some nights, while they were scudding in mid-channel, sailors saw by the black pine torches' flare Indians and whites hurling spears into the twisting flanks of leaping 200-pound sturgeon. Perhaps most beautiful of all were the quiet, clear hours when the blue hills had been lost in darkness and a little breeze brought swirling clouds of fireflies to give their evanescent imitation of the distant stars." When Robert Fulton dryly noted that he had traveled from New York to Albany in 32 hours, he was marking the beginning of a revolutionary age. Attempts by others to make the steam engine practical were either unsuccessful or ignored. Robert R. Livingston, however, made an excellent partner for Fulton, whose engagement to the Chancellor's cousin Harriet was announced that very day. While New Jersey protested in vain, the New York legislature, friendly to the Fulton-Livingston partnership, granted them a monopoly on all steamboat traffic on the Hudson River. A big-bone boat captain of Dutch extraction named Cornelius Vanderbilt, who was yet to establish his name and fortune in steamboats and railroads, ran a little steam ferry from Elizabethtown, New Jersey to the Battery, frustrating the numerous attempts by the New York authorities to arrest him. Eventually, the Supreme Court ruled that the monopoly, in the words of Chief Justice John Marshall, was repugnant to the Constitution and the laws of the United States. In a very short time, competition came to the Hudson River in the form of steamboat traffic. N.P. Willis gives us a lively account of steamboat travel in 1840. The scene is one of inextricable confusion, and it's not till the 20 miles off the Palisades are well passed that the bewildered passenger knows rightly whether his wife, child, or baggage is not being left behind at the rate of 15 miles an hour. "15 minutes before the starting, the boat has not a passenger aboard. Time is money, and the American, counting it as part of the expense, determines to pay only on demand. He arrives on the narrow pier at the same instant with 700 men, ladies, and children, besides lapdogs, crammed baskets, uncut novels, and baggage for the whole. No commissioner in the whole world could guarantee to get all this freight on board in the given time, and yet it's done. The plank is drawn in, the wheels begin to paw like foaming steeds, impatient to be off. The bell rings as if it were letting down the steps of the last hackney coach, and away darts the boat like half a town suddenly slipping off and taking a walk in the water. The black head waiter rings a handbell as if he were crazy, exhorting them passengers as hasn't settled to step to the captain's office and settle. And angry people who've lost sight of their portmanteaus, and selfish people who will not get up to let the young gentleman see if his penny trumpet is under them, play a real-life farce better than Keeley or Liston. A painted notice and a very fat black woman in the doorway informed the gentleman, who's not seen his wife since the boat started and is not at all sure that she's on board, that no gentleman is permitted to enter the ladies' cabin. And in spite of his dreadful uncertainty, he's obliged to trust to the dark Hebe to find her among 300 ladies by description, and amuses all listeners with his inventory of her dress features and general appearance. The broad waters of the Tappan Zee open before the flying cutwater, and those who love gentle worth and true genius begin to look out for Sleepy Hollow and the House of Washington Irving. It's a quiet little spot. May his latter days, when they shall come, find there the reverence and repose which are his due. Andrew Jackson Downing, the landscape gardener, born in Newburgh, became a great popularizer of Gothic revival and Hudson River bracketed, together with pioneer American architect A.J. Davis. Downing urged the creation of a great park in New York City. His pupil and assistant, Calvert Vaux, with Frederick Olmsted, were indeed to plan and build over a period of 20 years that 840-acre masterpiece, Central Park. At Newburgh in July 1852, Downing, with his wife and several relatives, came aboard the New York steamer Henry Clay. Calvert Vaux, with Frederick Olmsted, watched the Armenia going downriver. When the Armenia failed to make a regular passenger stop, Collier took up the challenge and headed out after the sister ship. The Henry Clay cut through the choppy whitecaps of the ebb tide, its funnel belching yellow sparks as it proceeded downriver at top speed. Suddenly, a fireman from the boiler room appeared on deck, his clothes on fire. As he jumped overboard, the midship section of the Henry Clay burst into flame. The ship swung toward the east bank at Riverdale, full speed ahead. Terrified, screaming passengers started dashing forward through the flames, but they were warned back by a ship's officer. In a few minutes, the Henry Clay struck the shore, burying its prow 8 feet into the earth bank. For many passengers were thrown to the deck below and into the water. The rest, trapped by the flames, were forced to jump. Among the 80 dead was the 36-year-old Andrew Jackson Downing, who was in the prime of his career. At their trial, Collier and his co-defendants were acquitted, but the New York legislature passed a law which finally put an end to the racing of the big steamers forever. Perhaps the all-time favorite steamboat of the Hudson River was the Mary Powell, built in 1861 in Jersey City. She was 300 feet long, the undisputed river queen, the fastest, the smoothest, and always on time. Absalom Anderson, who planned her, was her captain for many years. Once he sold her, but soon bought her back and stripped her of the cheap Rococo ornamentation her new owners had added. Anderson loved her clean lines and did not want to see them cluttered. He insisted it slowed her down. He never ran her on Sunday, and he never sold liquor aboard her. Once, she'd carried the body of George Custer to West Point. When Absalom died, his son, Captain A.E. Anderson, continued the tradition. He and the Mary Powell grew old together. A.E. died before she made her last run on the day lines. She ended her days in the Roundout Creek, where she was slowly dismantled and sold for junk and souvenirs. The Mary Powell had been part of the river for almost 60 years. Natural waterways like the Hudson River were the early superhighways. The Mohawk River adjoining the upper Hudson offered a water link into the interior wilderness. However, it was not always navigable. A canal dug along this route would allow a continuous waterway to reach from the Atlantic to the Great Lakes. The idea of building the canal had struck President Jefferson as a little short of madness. Laborers, many of them Irish, went through soggy marshland, fighting off the clouds of mosquitoes that brought death and malaria, digging from one red-painted stick to the next, while cutting through dense forest and blasting away rock. Once completed, the Erie Canal was an enormous success, setting off a canal-building fever in the rest of the country. Freight costs dropped from 19 cents per ton per mile to less than 1 cent. Thousands of immigrants moved westward. Grain and lumber products began to flow along the canal from the farms in Ohio, Michigan, and Illinois through Buffalo on Lake Erie and down the Hudson, bringing prosperity to Troy, Albany, and New York City. In the summer of 1825, while all the Hudson Valley was preparing for the opening of the Erie Canal, a penniless young painter from England journeyed up the river and there discovered the Catskill Mountains. 3 Hudson River views were displayed in a frame shop. They were seen and would soon be bought by a new patronage, men like Luman Reed, a wholesale grocer whose prosperity would come from the Erie Canal. Thomas Cole, who was to initiate the Hudson River School and make the landscape of wilderness as worthy a subject for paintings as portraiture and history, was himself from the smoke-filled center of England's Industrial Revolution. To the American, wilderness was dangerous, something to be cleared, hacked away, and pulled down so that civilization might prevail and progress. Now he was being taught to look upon the wildness of nature as something noble to contemplate. Cole, too, was divided between his desire to find nature sublime and the reality of his experience. Alone as I was, he writes, on the shore of that dark, unrippled water with towering precipices above and almost impervious around, where the voice of man was not heard, nor the sound of the axe, there was an awfulness in the utter solitude. It was almost painful. Men may seek such scenes and find pleasure in the discovery, but there is a mysterious fear comes over him and hurries him away. The sublime features of nature are too severe for a lone man to look upon and be happy. Nevertheless, soon the woods were full of bearded young men carrying easels and boxes of paint. There was Asher B. Durand, the skilled engraver from the Jersey side of the Hudson, J.F. Cropsey, and Albert Bierstadt, John F. Kensett, and the last of the school, Frederick Church. At 18, Church, who came from a wealthy family and refused a gentleman's education, had gone to study 3 years at Cole's Cottage at Catskill. By the age of 31 in 1857, he was at the top of his profession. After Church and his wife returned from a trip abroad to Athens and Syria, they decided to build Olana, standing high on a hill overlooking the Hudson. a meeting of East and West and of man and nature. Calvert Vaux, the man who built Central Park, was the architect. Over the years, Church, who became crippled with arthritis, decorated the 37 rooms with Persian designs, playing with reflections and contrasts of light and dark. When Frederick Church died in 1900, one obituary called him a painter of great talent whose art had gone completely out of fashion. What came to be derided in the 20th century as vistas of the Earth's anatomy belonging to a traveling show had awed and delighted 19th century viewers, who in fact paid 25 cents to see the latest Church painting when it came through town. In the 1830s, few merchants realized the railroad would ever replace the Erie Canal as a freight carrier, yet attempts to secure a charter for the New York and Hudson Railroad, running from Chambers Street up the Hudson to Greenbush, across from Albany, were successfully lobbied against by steamboat interests until 1845. By 1849, the railroad had progressed as far as Peekskill. Rights of way had been obtained from property owners along the east bank of the river, later regretted by residents, such as Washington Irving, who grew to hate the noise and soot that he felt spoiled the idyllic setting of Sunnyside. On October 1st, 1851, the first train ran all the way to the ferry station at Greenbush. A reporter for the New York Daily Times was impressed by the smooth ride and the distance covered from New York City to Albany in 3 hours and 55 minutes. From now on, for the businessmen, the train was the only way to travel. Cornelius Vanderbilt was to become the outstanding figure in the New York railroads. By 1862, he'd sold out the 50-year interest in steamboats that had schooled him so well for eventual success in acquiring and combining the Hudson River and New York Harlem into the New York Central Railroad. Vanderbilt's costly attempt to gain control of the Erie Railroad was stymied by Daniel Drew, James Fisk, and Jay Gould, who printed and sold him phony stock. More successful were his acquisitions of 2 additional railroads, which gave him a route straight through to Chicago from New York. The Commodore left a fortune of over $100 million. His son William built Grand Central Station in 1871, torn down and replaced by the present structure in 1913. Because of civic pressure, the New York Central put the tracks underground, leading to the terminal along Park Avenue. merchants of New York had always faced the sea, looking to Europe for manufactured goods. Starting in 1825, domestic trade fairly exploded once the Erie and other canals were completed. The building of the railroads followed, and so did the growth of manufacturing. By the Civil War, New York merchants looked inland, away from foreign trade. New York's unrivaled transportation network meant raw materials were always easily accessible, and so were markets for finished products. The factory system was growing rapidly, especially in textiles, as New York followed Boston's lead. The elaborate Victorian mills built at the confluence of the Mohawk and Hudson Rivers in Cohoes are an example of industry that sprang up along the route of the Erie Canal in the 19th century. A dam across the Mohawk above the Cohoes Falls created 10 canals that threaded their way through the city. The great vertical turbines, at the time the largest in the U.S., transmitted the drive to the mainline shafts on each floor by leather belts. By the 1870s, the Harmony Mills was described as the richest, the largest, and the most complete cotton manufacturing establishment on the American continent. When an electric generating plant was built at the base of the falls, the canal system providing water for the direct mechanical driving of machinery was made obsolete. The changeover required at once a large investment of capital, and the owners of the mills were no longer part of the community, and being absentee had taken profits away from Cohoes, ignoring even routine maintenance. Eventually, the mills converted to hydroelectric power, but they continued to decline. And in the 1930s, they were closed. The Harmony Mills complex is again in use and remains a fascinating relic of a great period of industrialization. While the shells have taken on the patina of neglect, one European visitor recently observed, factories are America's cathedrals, rising as a tribute to her great contribution of modern technology. He saw a serene beauty in them, which we ourselves are only beginning to see. A Scotsman and immigrant mechanic, Henry Burden, arrived in Troy in 1819 to work for Stephen Van Rensselaer. By 1835, Burden had acquired half the stock of the Troy Iron and Nail Factory and invented a horseshoe machine which made Troy world famous by turning out 3,600 finished horseshoes every hour. During the Civil War, the availability of Burden and Sons' automated horseshoes gave the North great industrial advantage over the South. The bold new office building of 1882 is today the only survivor among acres of machinery. As the new century approached, Troy as an iron manufacturing center was growing old. It was being replaced by new technologies further west, by steelworks with better access to coal ore and markets, whose management seemed more dynamic and labor force less troublesome. Between 1825 and 1855, the population of New York State doubled, the same as for the rest of the nation. But New York City, at the opening of the Civil War, had quadrupled in size to over 1 million inhabitants. There'd always been a shortage of labor in the New World until the 1840s, when immigrants began to arrive in great numbers, first the Irish and Germans, English, Scotch, and Welsh. Then in the 1880s, more Germans, followed by Jews and Italians. Between 1890 and 1930, Poles, Czechs, and Russians came, making a total of 22 million immigrants arriving in the U.S. from every country in Europe, Mexico, and Canada, each one drawn by some private hope. They found they would have to endure countless, often heartbreaking hardships during the 2-month voyage with its overcrowding, disease, bad air, and bad food. When they arrived, this group of immigrants was already replacing the group before it with cheaper, more willing labor, and for it, they would be resented and exploited. Tenement buildings put up cheaply by speculators could average 6 persons to a 10 by 12-foot room. Though other cities upstate had their inner city slums, 5 Points off Broadway was one of the worst. In 1851, George Templeton Strong wrote, "We have our 5 Points, our immigrant quarters, our swarms of seamstresses to whom their utmost toil and monotonous daily drudgery give only bare subsistence, a life barren of hope and enjoyment. Our hordes of dock thieves and of children who live in the streets and by them. No one can walk the length of Broadway without meeting some hideous troop of ragged girls from 12 years down, brutalized already almost beyond redemption by premature vice, clad in the filthy refuge of the rag-pickers' collections, obscene of speech, the stamp of childhood gone from their faces, with thief written in their cunning eyes and horror on their depraved faces." Between the close of the Civil War and the Great Depression, the U.S. shifted from a nation of rural farms into the richest and most powerful industrial economy in the world. During this period, the self-sustaining farm community disappeared. The merchant capitalists replaced the craftsmen as the center of power. They purchased the raw materials, and then they went about reducing costs by lowering wages, hiring immigrant labor, and undercutting the system of apprenticeship. Thus, the skilled craftsman, once the aristocrat of labor, was gradually replaced by the urban factory worker, and not until union bargaining became effective did he have control over his wages and working conditions. Franklin Roosevelt was elected governor of New York State in 1928 at the height of the boom times, times of rising consumption of goods and easy credit. He finished out his first term 2 years later with the nation in the depths of the Great Depression and 12 million Americans out of work. Franklin Roosevelt, a descendant of an old and respected New York Dutch family, part of the landed aristocracy of the Hudson Valley, was born at the family estate in Hyde Park in 1882. Eleanor Roosevelt later wrote that Franklin always returned to Hyde Park to find rest and peace and strength. Roosevelt was one of a number of 20th century political figures who helped redeem New York's tarnished record of corruption and boss rule, but he was a cautious governor, far from the daring and outspoken president of innovative social legislation he was to become. He'd already fixed his eye on the presidency and was extremely careful not to alienate certain blocks of votes, which in the end, he inadvertently alienated anyway. Perhaps his reluctance as governor to make enemies of the entrenched political bosses helped him form the first words he spoke to the American public as president on March 4th, 1933. First of all, let me assert my firm belief, he said, that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. In every dark hour of our national life, a leadership of frankness and vigor has met with that understanding and support of the people themselves, which is essential to victory. I am convinced that you will again give that support to leadership in these critical days. The river, like the ironworks at Troy, was aging badly under man's carelessness. She was dirty and you couldn't swim her anymore. The oysters were gone. There was a question of whether the fish were safe to eat. But the war was over and Franklin Roosevelt was dead, and maybe we began to associate his death with something about the river. The great battles for democracy that had been fought right here in the valley were part of history. They no longer had anything to do with our modern lives. It all happened long ago to men and women we no longer knew. For this was the time that people turned their faces away from the river. That noble stream that European visitors exclaimed was more beautiful than the Rhine. Today, there are still small river towns with their handful of houses, a general store, and a churchyard cemetery. On the headstones and the little fenced-off plots are the rain-etched and time-worn names of the men and women of the past. They came to settle the valley, to farm. They fished the river, became the fur traders, learned to navigate the ebb and flood tides and sail with the windy gusts that still blow around the ancient granite mountains like Storm King and Breakneck. They fought the wars they felt had to be fought and worked the mines and industries that ultimately shaped their lives. Surrounding the chipped headstones, some lying in the grass like so many salt licks, is the Hudson Valley with its great river. In many ways, the river appears today as it must have been first glimpsed by those adventurous few. The Hudson slowly moving downriver with a salty tide to become once again part of the sea.